presentations, mine goes over an awful lot of the same ground, so I'm going to move kind of quickly through this thing. But I'm going to talk about tomorrow's memories, and I'm going to focus on cost more than anything, although I'm going to talk about that a bit. I've got a couple of advertising kind of slides here. Objective analysis, we're a market research firm, three of us, ex-Gartner Data Quest analysts, who happen to be really good at forecasting the semiconductor market. So I just put those up so they'll stay on the PDF that goes online. So what I'm going to talk about is that there is going to be change, that, because of the fact that there's scaling limits, I talked about, we're going to have to use some new approaches. We're at a time of change right now. Revolutionary changes cause delays. Nobody anticipates these delays, and I'll talk to you a little bit about what has caused delays in the past, what's going to cause delays in the future, and what the effects are going to be of those. Costs, once again focusing on costs, they dictate the way that the market changes, and nothing ever moves as quickly as expected. So first we'll talk a little bit about what the issues are, and this is something that Naga talked about, is we've got problems with the capacitance between control gates and floating gates that have driven us to go into new structures and also to use new materials. We've got lithography issues. Immersion lithography is a very expensive kind of technology, and it's something that as we go to EUV, it's going to be even more expensive. And multiple patterning, which is an expensive way to do patterning. And then finally, issues related to the number of electrons on a gate in NAND flash. Just to give you a little bit of an overview about where the problem came from, is with the original floating gate geometry, you had this structure that could be scaled very easily this way. You would shrink the control gate, and the only problem with that was that the capacitor got smaller. The problem with making that capacitor smaller is that it scales the plate area, determines how many electrons go on there, and the plate area scales as a square root, or as a square of the lithography shrink. And so because of that, you're losing electrons at an accelerating rate over time. The approach that has been used in the past few the result of that is you have a shrinking electron count. This is actually a very old slide, something from Intel when they were talking about NOR flash back about 5 years ago. It only goes up to 32 nanometers. A lot of advances have been made since then to actually take this NAND line and bump it up, including capped cell structure, which is what I'm going to show here. What you do to get more capacitance is you wrap the control gate around the floating gate. And this, once again, is something that Naga showed. And that's a structure that's been used with some success. You can see actually scanning electron microscope photograph of it here. The problem that you get into with that is that you've got material now limiting how close you can put things. So as you shrink the cells, then you have to also squeeze out all the material that's in between them. You can't make these layers any thinner than a certain amount. And so that ends up causing you another problem. And then finally, you've got the need to go to multiple patterning. And this is something that my friends at Applied Material, ASM Lithography, ASML gave to me. That's a really good way of showing how this all works. Let me see it. So the laser in here. This is kind of a complicated slide, and the laser pointer is not very bright, so I'll just talk about it. We've got the size of the process geometry on the vertical axis. You've got these different processes that were being made across the bottom axis. And what the gray line is this is showing you how your process is actually shrinking, except for the place where it jumps up, which is 3D. And so it shows that you're doing constant process shrinks, but the way that you're getting there is by using lithography that you're double patterning. So instead of using this one works better. So here, 45 nanometers, you use a 45 nanometer lithography to actually produce 45 nanometers. When you get down here to 35 nanometers, you use 70 nanometer lithography and double patterning to get it down there. You can take that down to a certain level. You can't take it below this dotted line here. You can take it down to, I think that's about 55 nanometers to get your 27 nanometer process geometry. But then once you want to get down here to sub 20 nanometer lithography, you have to go up to quad level patterning. And you can't just keep doing that forever. You run into a lot of issues when you're going to multiple patterning, and it also drives up your expenses because the process significantly more complicated. And so 3D NAND has been proposed as an alternative. This is the applied materials slide, or ETERIS, I guess it is, that shows what 3D NAND actually works with. And Naga showed the different parts of this. This is showing them all together. These are actually your NAND flash strings. You've got your control gates along here, so your word lines. They get brought out to the side in a stair-step structure, and then vertical vias are put in to allow those to be accessed by logic that sits, or routing, sits on top of the entire chip. It's a really complicated structure, but it seems to be our way forward, our way of getting more bits on a chip. This involves an awful lot of new technologies, which are unfortunately things we've never done before. And so you've got thin film transistors in the channel, and nobody's built NAND flash using thin film before, unless Micron really is, as Ed said, using a single crystalline silicon. Then that would get away from that. But charge trap NAND is commonly used in these, and Samsung had an abortive effort to bring a charge trap NAND flash out in 2006. I think they're probably still having problems with it. You've got the stair step that I showed you in the prior slide. I'll just take you back to that. This thing here. That nobody's ever etched a stair step that has multiple steps like that before. I think they've done 2 steps and 4 steps, but getting down to 32 steps, 48 steps, and then on into the future, that's going to require some technologies that we haven't developed before, or that are in development right now. Your source and drain aren't doped in this vertical channel. You can't do that because you can't pattern that way. You've got these extraordinary aspect ratios. Typically in DRAM, you've got like a 40-to-1 aspect ratio, and in NAND flash, you're going to be going to 60-to-1, maybe even higher aspect ratios. And so that's going to require very tight control of the way that you etch. These multi-layer depositions, those are things that haven't been done before. And so we've got all of these different technologies that we haven't done before. It's just a very long list. Now, I like to look back at DRAM to see what went on, what is likely to go on with NAND flash. I think there's a very good proxy. They're very similar kinds of markets. This is the price per gigabyte of DRAM over the history that WSTS has tracked it. And this is 1991 out through 2011. You can see that it follows a kind of a lumpy line, but since it's on a semi-log chart, there's a logarithmic here, that it kind of follows a straight line along here. I'll show more of that later. That is actually kind of the way that the cost moves for DRAM. So then the question is, why does it go flat at some points? Well, this one I didn't circle because that's the internet bubble, and there was a shortage, and so the prices stayed high. This one here, though, and that one there are worth circling because those are 2 times when we had technology problems that caused DRAM to stop scaling for a couple of years. This one here is in 1992 through 1995. We had an upturn, and it stayed an upturn for an extra 1.5 years for a technology change that proved to be enormously challenging for DRAM manufacturers. At the time, PC had become the biggest market for DRAM, and the PC manufacturers needed DRAMs that were not 1 bit wide or 4 bits wide, but they needed 8 or 16 bits wide. DRAM manufacturers said, that's easy, we'll just put on more I/O. And they caused themselves phenomenal noise problems by doing that. They weren't able to actually conquer those noise problems until late 1995, and that resulted in an oversupply and a price crash, which that typically happens at the end of a stable pricing period. So that was a very simple kind of a thing that caused a stall in the process migration. Here we've got something that also sounds like a pretty, not too difficult thing, and that was getting to 90 nanometers. Everybody had done lithography shrinks one after the other, and some of them quite successfully. They got to 90 nanometers, and all of a sudden nothing worked. And so they got an extra year added on to their shortage by doing that. And so if you look at that list that I just showed you on the prior slide, all of these things that were changing, this isn't just moving to 90 nanometers. This isn't just going to 16-bit wide interfaces from 4-bit wide interfaces. It's a huge number of changes, and I'm expecting it to cause a shortage for 3D NAND that is going to go out for a couple of years from where any of the manufacturers anticipate it going right now. After 3D has run its course, then we'll have a scaling limit. You know, the scaling limit is a term that we usually use for planar, but you know, something like that. Eventually we'll get to a point where 3D will no longer scale because there are not enough layers in there. And we'll be able to get other technologies to scale past. And that's where these new technologies that everybody's talking about, PCM possibly, MRAM, RRAM, ferroelectric, even carbon nanotubes. One of them is going to have an opportunity to actually take over from NAND flash. But it's not clear which one, and that's because I'm expecting it to take a very long time. It's not that there isn't a technology advantage to using these things. All new memories are better than NAND flash. I've got NAND here and attributes of NAND flash that are tricky, and then the new memory here and you know how they compare against it. And so for NAND, you've got serial read. For any of these new memories that I just mentioned, you've got random read. That's an enormous benefit right there. For NAND, you have to erase a block before you write to it. With all of these other new memories, you can just overwrite the old data. With NAND, you have this clumsy setup where you have to erase an entire block, but then you can write in smaller increments in pages. Whereas with the new memories, you can write in individual bytes. That ends up being, you know, just a colossal benefit when you're managing the technology. NAND has a slow write. The new memories all have much faster writes, although sometimes their reads are faster than their writes. NAND has a lot of bit errors inside. I'm expecting to see lower error rates with these other technologies. And then finally, with NAND flash, you've got actually very sensitive wear. TLC typically will wear out if it's been written 200s of times. And with these other technologies, you're going to have much less wear. So all of these technologies are technically better, but technically better doesn't really get you anywhere. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to say this. There's one thing that it opens up a path to, is something Naga talked about, is storage class memory, where you can actually, if you replace DRAM with one of these technologies, then you can have a memory that doesn't die when the power goes off. But the trouble is the cost is more important than anything else. You don't see technologies really doing well, becoming major markets until their cost falls below market leaders. And even though all of these new technologies have better technical attributes than NAND flash, they're not likely to displace any appreciable amount of NAND flash until the cost gets down. It's a highly competitive market, and memories are a commodity. And so because of that, then people don't buy things based on technical attributes, they buy based on price. Now, the reason why everybody's so focused on this is because the only way that semiconductor manufacturers know how to sell anything is if its price goes down. I think that if you were to take a semiconductor marketing manager and you were to stick them into some other business where the prices didn't go down, like selling produce or something, they'd probably end up completely lost. You wouldn't know how to sell a head of lettuce for the same price 10 years from now that they sell it for now. So, you know, because of that, you've got to have this very steady going down. This is the same chart that I showed here of DRAM pricing over the time that it was measured. And if you project back to 1970, it was pretty much along the same line. And that's just Moore's law. As you double the number of transistors on the chip every year or two, then you end up getting cost decreases because the wafers cost about the same amount. Cost is what brought NAND flash into computing. We wouldn't have SSDs today if it weren't for the fact that in 2004, NAND flash prices actually crossed over DRAM prices and got below it. Today, NAND flash is selling for about 1/20th as much as DRAM. And you see an awful lot of people in server applications who are putting SSDs into their servers in order to reduce the amount of DRAM that they use. This is something that's an architectural change, and it's probably going to take a stronger effect later on. This has been a big boost to the NAND flash market, and as a result, we now see SSDs and enterprise flash applications becoming the most important application after cell phones in flash. And so the way that alternative memories will win out is by getting down to lower cost than NAND flash. This is a chart that I've shown for years, and it probably bears some updating. It doesn't really account for 3D. But this is, if you have NAND flash going down this curve here, once again on a semi-log chart, you know, going down at a very steady rate. And then you have another technology that is scaling and has exactly the same process geometries, which none of them do right now, but let's just assume that they do. But let's say that the wafer costs twice as much, then you're going to end up with a bit cost that's twice as much. And that's what this offset is between these lines, is that red line is always twice as expensive as the black line. And so how does the red line ever cross over the black line? Well, the way that they do it, or the way that it would happen, is when NAND gets to a scaling limit, or gets to a limit to how many layers can be done in 3D, or something like that. You know, I guess you could actually say that this is Naga's scaling line, where he was showing scaling, legitimate scaling here, and then 3D effective gate size here. And, you know, when you get to a point where there are more layers, you know, too many layers, you can't do anything with it, and you still end up reaching a scaling limit. You can't bring the cost down anymore, no matter what process you go to. And when you get to that point, then any of these new technologies that has the ability to scale down smaller because it's not working with stored electrons, any of those has the opportunity to crash past NAND flash pricing. I'm expecting, though, for that to take about 2 process geometry changes, 2 nodes, for that crossover to actually happen. So we'll probably have another one of those stalls whenever that happens. So how do you reach across parity? I kind of said this, is that if the wafer is twice as expensive, then you have to have 2 times as many bits on the wafer. And the way to do that is just by doing it with, you know, 70% linear shrink. But if you do 3D, then you end up having to go with those effective channel lengths, and that ends up getting a little bit trickier. So here's a timeline that I actually put together in 2013 for the Hot Chips conference of how I see the markets going for NPM. And so we had 1X planar cells in 2013, and a lot of manufacturers were approaching that by using high kV dielectric. 2015, 1Y nanometer, and we're there right now. 2017, I've been saying that I expect that to be the year that we really see 3D NAND flash shipping in volume and competing against planar NAND. However, now I see a lot of manufacturers of NAND flash saying 2017 is the year, and so now I'm starting to think, well, given all of this apprehension I have about how difficult it's going to be to make, then I expect that to maybe slip out a little bit more into possibly 2018. And then we have the next generation, 2019, and then possibly the final generation in 2021. You know, there are a lot of things we don't know here. We don't know how many layers are going to be able to take 3D NAND to. It could go generations past this. But also, it might not keep that same rhythm that we've had with Moore's Law scaling. And so because of that, you know, I'm expecting to see, you know, some changes in this chart over time. But in the end, I'm saying that 2023 is the year that we would expect to see some other technology, other form of technology, actually replace NAND flash and threaten NAND flash. And so in summary, you know, we've got scaling limits that are driving NAND to 3D. We're expecting later problems to lead to revolutionary changes, and it's all because of cost, and everybody's trying to drive the cost down. But I'm really watching out for delays. I'm expecting delays to happen and build forecasts on this. So with that, I'd like to ask if anybody has any questions. We've got a couple of minutes for questions here.
New questioner, but since there's not.
There's one in the corner.
Oh. Well, since you had no competition.
Jim, nice presentation. I want to refer back to that ASML slide when you showed the scaling of the device going from 25 to 16. Then when you introduced 3D, it goes up to 50 something. Okay, so for NAND flash, I can understand the path down because usually you're talking